An army crossed the desert and swept away everything Israel had planted. The Midianites came whenever the harvest ripened. No messengers, no declaration of war. They simply appeared from the east in numbers that Scripture compares to locusts covering the land. So many that the ground disappeared beneath the hooves of their animals. Wheat, barley, olive groves, flocks. What a whole year of labor had produced, they consumed in days. And when they left, they took even the last seed. 7 years in succession. 7 times the same harvest destroyed before it could be gathered. 7 winters with no reserve. Israel vanished into the land itself. Caves in the mountains, crevices among the rocks, burrows dug far from the roads, far from anywhere they could be seen. The people who had crossed the Red Sea, who had seen walls fall before trumpets, now waited in silence for the sound of hooves to fade on the horizon. The borders were empty, the fields silent. No army organized resistance, no leader rose up. The promised land had become a hiding place. And then, from somewhere inside the rocks, someone cried out to God. Scripture does not say who it was. It does not say from which cave the cry came, nor how many voices joined it. It says only that the cry went up, and that God heard. What came after this would change the history of Israel, but not in the way anyone expected. God chose a man who was hiding. Gideon was threshing wheat inside a winepress, a pit hewn out of rock used for pressing grapes, deep enough that no one could see him from a distance. It was there that he hid his work. If the Midianites passed along the road, the grain would disappear along with him. It was in that place that the angel of the Lord appeared and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon looked around. He was alone, crouched low, with grain upon his knees, hiding from an enemy that had not even arrived. His reply was direct. "If the Lord is with us, where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about? Where are the miracles of Egypt? Where is anything that could justify such a statement? The Lord has abandoned us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." It was an accusation, not a doubt. Gideon knew what God had done in the past, and he could plainly see what God seemed to be allowing in the present. The contrast between the two was the burden he carried every day inside that pit. And God answered with a command, not an explanation. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel from the hand of the Midianites." The voice did not explain the silence of the previous 7 years. The voice simply pointed and said, "Go." Gideon drew back. "My family is the poorest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." With that, the picture was complete. The chosen man belonged to a small tribe, from a family of no standing, hidden in a pit, with flour upon his knees, without an army, without a plan, without any visible qualification for what was being asked of him. But the command had been given. and that for what was to come was enough. God's first command to Gideon was to destroy something inside his own house. The altar of Baal stood on his father's land. Beside it was a sacred pole of Asherah. For years, those structures had remained standing, tolerated, used, part of the familiar landscape. And God commanded Gideon to tear it all down that very night. He built a new altar on the top of the rock. He offered his father's bull, using the wood of the pole he had cut down as fuel for the fire. Gideon chose 10 trusted men and carried out the command while the city slept. Early in the morning, the men of the city found the wreckage. The altar of Baal had been demolished. The pole of Asherah had been torn down. In their place stood a new altar with the ashes of a sacrifice still fresh. The investigation was swift. The tracks led back to the house of Joash, Gideon's father. The city demanded his death. Joash stood at the gate and faced the crowd. If Baal is a god, let him contend with Gideon himself. Let him defend himself. The logic was simple and cutting. A god who needs men to avenge his honor may not be a god worth defending. The crowd drew back. Gideon was still alive. The altar was still standing. And the spiritual conflict that would dominate the chapters to come had revealed itself before any military battle. The war began inside the house, against an altar the people themselves had built. The Midianites crossed the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. The report reached Gideon. The enemy had arrived in force. Midianites, Amalekites, the people of the east, all together, an army that later texts would number at 135,000 men. They were stationed in the valley, waiting. The Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon. He sounded the trumpet. The tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali responded. 32,000 men gathered around him. Then Gideon asked for a sign. He placed a fleece of wool on the ground and made a request that the dew should fall only on the fleece, while the ground around it remained dry. The next morning, he wrung out the fleece and filled an entire bowl with water. The ground around it was dry. He asked for the opposite the following night, that the fleece should remain dry, while the dew fell on the ground. God answered both times. What the text reveals at this moment is the distance between the command received and the confidence required to fulfill it. Gideon had torn down his father's altar. He had sounded the trumpet. He had gathered an army, and still he needed to ask twice whether it was real. God answered both times. The battle was still far off, but the man who would enter it had changed. Not because the doubt had disappeared, but because God had crossed through that doubt twice and continued forward all the same. God looked at the 32,000 men gathered together and said they were too many. Military logic said that Israel was still at a disadvantage. 32,000 against 135,000 was a ratio of almost 1 to 4. But God pointed in another direction. With that number, Israel could win and then credit the victory to its own strength. That credit God would not yield. The first elimination was simple. Any man who was afraid was dismissed. He could go home. 22,000 left. 10,000 remained. They were still too many. The second elimination was strange. God told Gideon to take the men down to the water and observe how each one drank. Those who knelt down and put their faces to the water were separated to one side. Those who remained standing and brought the water to their mouths with their hands were separated to the other. 9,700 on one side, 300 on the other. God pointed to the 300 and said, "With these I will save Israel." Gideon dismissed the remaining 9,700 and was left with the 300 men. The final ratio was 450 enemies for every Israelite soldier. By every visible calculation, it was an impossible mission. And that was exactly what God had carefully constructed. Elimination by elimination, until no human explanation remained for what was about to happen. The victory, when it came, could be attributed to only one thing. That night, God spoke to Gideon one final time before the battle. "Rise, go down to the camp. I have delivered it into your hands." And then, as though he knew what the man still needed, he added, "If you are afraid to go down with your servant Purah, and you shall hear what they say, and afterwards your hands will be strengthened." Gideon went down with Purah to the edge of the enemy camp. The Midianite camp stretched across the valley like a dark stain. Endless tents, animals sleeping by the thousands, sentries moving around the perimeter, and there, in the darkness, 2 men of Israel stood still and listened. One soldier was telling his companion a dream. A loaf of barley bread had rolled down the hill, entered the camp, and struck a tent, overturning it until it collapsed. His companion answered without hesitation, "This can only be the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has delivered the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Gideon heard the dream. He heard the interpretation, and he bowed down in worship. The man who had entered that camp in fear came out as one who had heard the enemy announce its own defeat. God had placed the prophecy inside the opposing camp and sent Gideon there to hear it. He returned to the 300 and said, "Rise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of the Midianites into your hands." Gideon divided the 300 into 3 groups of 100. Each man received a trumpet, an earthenware jar, and a burning torch inside the jar. The instruction was clear: "Watch what I do and do the same. When I reach the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do." It was midnight. The God had just changed. The 3 groups surrounded the camp on 3 sides at once. Gideon broke the jar. The other 300 did the same. 300 jars shattered at the same moment in the silence of the early hours. The torches appeared. The trumpets sounded. The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. The camp awoke into chaos. 300 burning torches on 3 sides, 300 trumpets sounding without cease, 300 men standing still, motionless, holding fire and making noise, without advancing, without attacking, without forming any visible ranks. The Midianite army collapsed before it knew where the attack was coming from. Men ran, others drew their swords and struck whoever stood beside them. The camp turned against itself. 135,000 soldiers fleeing in opposite directions, trampling one another in the darkness, while 300 torches remained fixed on the hills around them. Israel came down from the neighboring tribes to pursue the fugitives. The Jordan was cut off. The Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, were captured and killed. The battle had lasted 1 night. The army fled. But 2 kings were still alive. Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian, had crossed the Jordan with 15,000 men, what remained of an army that had begun the night with 135,000. Gideon crossed the river after them with the 300, exhausted yet still moving. Along the way, he stopped at Succoth and asked for bread for his men. The answer of the city's leaders was calculated. Why should we give bread to your army while Zebah and Zalmunna are still alive? It was a wager for survival. If Gideon were defeated beyond the Jordan, those who had fed his army would pay the price. Gideon did not argue. He promised to return and pressed on. Penuel repeated the refusal. Gideon made the same promise and continued. The enemy camp was found further ahead. The remaining 15,000 were off guard. The pursuit had arrived before any defense could be organized. Gideon attacked, scattered the army, and captured the 2 kings with his own hands. On the way back, he fulfilled his promises. The elders of Succoth were punished. The tower of Penuel was torn down. The war had begun with an army of 135,000 men sweeping over Israel like locusts. It ended with 2 kings captured, a river crossed, and 300 exhausted men bringing back what they had promised to bring. Only one thing remained. Gideon looked at the 2 kings and asked a question. What were the men like whom you killed at Tabor? The answer of Zebah and Zalmunna was direct. They were like you. Each one had the appearance of a king's son. They were my brothers, Gideon said, the sons of my mother. What had seemed to be a war of national deliverance revealed in that moment a personal layer the text had kept hidden until then. The men killed at Tabor had names, they had faces, and Gideon knew them. He turned to his eldest son, Jether, and ordered him to kill the 2 kings. Jether was young. He did not draw his sword. Zebah and Zalmunna saw the hesitation and spoke directly to Gideon. Rise yourself and strike us, for as the man is, so is his strength. Gideon rose and killed them. He took the crescent-shaped ornaments from the necks of their camels, the symbol of Midianite power, the adornment of kings, and kept them for himself. The war had begun with Israel hiding in caves, with harvests destroyed, and a people without the strength to rise. It ended with Gideon standing over 2 dead kings, holding the ornaments they had worn as they crossed the desert, and erased everything Israel had built. The personal conflict was over. The spiritual conflict still had one final turn. Israel came to Gideon with an offer: "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, for you have delivered us from the hand of the Midianites." Gideon refused. "The Lord shall rule over you. I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you." The refusal was clear. But what came immediately afterwards changed the weight of the entire scene. Gideon asked for one thing: that each man should give him an earring from the captured spoil. The Israelites spread a garment on the ground and threw the earrings there. Gold from the defeated enemy. The final weight was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the ornaments of the kings, the pendants and the purple garments, and besides the chains from the camels. With that gold, Gideon cast an ephod. He placed it in Ophrah, his city. All Israel went there to bow down before it. The text uses a specific word: spiritual prostitution. The ephod became a snare to Gideon and to his whole house. The man who had torn down the altar of Baal at the beginning of the story built at the end of it an object that produced the same effect the altar had produced. The victory over the Midianites lasted 40 years. While Gideon lived, the land had rest. But the ephod remained in Ophrah long after Gideon died. And when he died, Israel returned to bowing down before the Baals. The war had been won. The land had rested. And yet, something had been crooked from the beginning, buried in the gold of the spoil, shaped in the hands of the deliverer himself, waiting for the right moment to destroy what the battle had built.